What's up, everybody, and welcome into the Sit Down, a Mafia History podcast. We are back better than ever. Another week, another show, another sit down. We get a great topic for you planned today. Another very interesting individual we're going to talk about. And I'll tell you, we say this seemingly every week just because there are so many compelling, interesting figures in the mob and in mob history. But I got to tell you, I'm not sure if there's a more what's the word I'm looking for? I guess interesting because I do think Greg Scarpa is a fascinating individual. I think he had a wildly interesting life and he kind of threaded the needle through multiple levels of Cosa Nostra and with the FBI. And, he kind of reminds me a bit of like some of Whitey Bulger's story, which we'll
Yep.
get to. Uh, but it's an interesting one. We're going to go through his entire life. We're going to talk about some really interesting things that went on. And really, if you heard the Persico show, this will help you a lot because Carmine and Greg were close. Greg was a loyalist to Carmine, and we'll definitely bring his name up. But let's bring in our co-host. As always, we are back. BlackJack Fletcher returns. Our co-host, our consigliere, our legal expert, BlackJack. How you doing? How's everything going this week?
Doing great, brother. I'm sitting here drinking some red wine, ready to talk about one of the biggest lunatics in Mafia
Yeah.
history, in Greg Scarpa.
Yeah. Well, we talk all the time about the difference in very successful Cosa Nostra people. And the thing that sets them both apart is look, there's either earners, there's murderers, and then there's guys that could do both. And a lot of the guys we've talked about so far are guys that did both. And that's one of the reasons they were bosses or high level people. Greg Scarpa was never a boss, but Greg Scarpa was very rich. He had a ton of money. He was very powerful, and he was Lord High Executioner, basically, in the Colombo Crime Family. So, when you look back at individuals that were hitmen, if you're making a list, I think you've got to put Greg Scarpa up at the top. And we'll kind of get into his interesting life and why one thing, Blackjack, early in his life, I think could have been a dead reason you don't ever involve him in the mob. And we'll get to that in just a second. But before we do that, I want to just kind of chat a little bit about the direction of the show going forward. And, we're 12 episodes in. This is our episode 12. And I've been so happy with this show. I've been really impressed with just what it's done. It's popular. People enjoy it. We're gaining steam every week. And one thing that I've continued to see, and I get DMs all the time about, hey, I love the show. I love this. I love that. Can you talk about this person? Can you talk about that person? And all that is fine. But I'm getting a continued amount of people that have either a disagreement or this disillusion that we are going to just come on here and talk about strict fact and we're only going to talk about honorable guys. Look, the truth of the matter with the mob is there are a lot of people that became informants. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with being an informant. My whole thing is if you're going to play in dirt and you get dirty, you got to get dirty and go to jail. That's how it works. But there are individuals in the history of this thing that didn't do that. And they went to the FBI and they cut a deal. But there are people that, constantly saying to me, why do you interview why do you talk about rats? Why are you giving these guys, platform? Why are you talking about their life? And, and I'm sure down the road, Blackjack, as we continue to get more popular with this show, who knows where we'll go next. There's going to be offers presented to us to talk to informants. And look, the history of the mafia cannot be told without talking about informants. It just can't. And it's so pervasive and it's become so pervasive in crime in general that it's got to be talked about. Look, I can't not talk about Joe Messino. I can't not talk about Greg Scarpa. I can't down the road not talk about Sammy Gravano. These are integral parts of the American mafia that we have to discuss. And I know there are people that don't like these people. And I listen, I'm not going to say I like them either. I don't like what they did. I don't find it honorable. But I think everybody's different. And I think everyone has a story. But Blackjack, we can't not tell the story of certain guys. And I will say one thing as well. This is our 12th show. Okay. Up until now, 11 episodes, we've done two informants on this show, Joe Messino and Whitey Bulger. And there was a question of whether did Whitey Bulger actually really, inform, or was it just a lot of hot air from John Connolly? So Blackjack, at the end of the day, the weave and the web that has been created by the mob, you have to talk about informants. It's just part of the business.
Yeah, there's no way around it, Jeff. I mean, like the history, the second part of the title to this show is the Sit Down, a Mafia History Podcast.
Right.
You can't tell the history of the mafia without talking about rats. I mean, they're there, right? They're integral parts of all of these organizations, and they have to be discussed. And like you said, if one day, hopefully, we get the chance to interview some of these guys, I would do it in a heartbeat. I just wouldn't go easy on them. Like, I'm not going to let them make it into some self-serving, promotional BS. Like, no, you're going to answer questions about what you did and why you did it.
Yeah, and I think anytime you're talking about and it's always going to come up. We talk about Joe Messina, like you have to tell the story, and that's what we do. We tell the story, and look, do I like the fact that some of these guys did this? No, I think there are I've talked before. There's a case in Chicago, the Family Secrets trial, where you had a guy that literally testified against his own father. And there's a lot of things with that story that I think are different than others. And then there are guys that, like Greg Scarpa, who for decades informed on his people and did it behind the scenes. I mean, they just have to be talked about, and they're going to be told. And, I will say this, I'm not going to, there's no crusade on this show. I have no agenda. I enjoy Mafia history, and I want to talk about it. I'm not going to get into arguments like, a lot of these channels do where they argue with each other. We're not doing that. We're just here to talk about mob history. We try to give you the facts. We try to tell compelling stories. And unfortunately, we're going to have to talk about informants. This is how the game is. And as BlackJack said, if we get the opportunity down the road to speak to some of these guys, I am going to ask them questions. I am going to ask them, do they regret doing it? I'm going to ask them. And look, a lot of them will respond with, well, I'm on the street and that guy's dead or in jail. And, at the end of the day, that's a pretty decent argument to make. Look, a lot of people inform. In fact, 90% of people inform because they don't want to go to jail. It's pretty simple. They want to live their life on the street. We've talked about Burton Kaplan, the guy that was involved with the Mafia guys. Burton Kaplan was, a guy that, from a stone cold standpoint, I don't know if there was a more Cosa Nostra guy than him. And he wasn't even Italian. He was a Jew. Right. But Burton Kaplan realized that he didn't want to live his old age, which is very difficult to do, out of prison. He didn't want to live it in prison. So Burton Kaplan said, you know what? And look, I think you could make a case that Burton Kaplan testified against 2 corrupt cops. So is he really a rat? I mean, you testifying against corrupt cops. Is that a rat move? We all have our agenda and what we think a rat is a rat. But, we have to do it. We're going to have to keep doing it. All right, let's get into Gregory Scarpa, one of the most interesting people you'll hear of. I know people have heard his name, but maybe they don't necessarily know. And there's a couple names that we're going to have to remember in Greg Scarpa's story. One of which is Linda Shiro. Linda Shiro was Greg's longtime girlfriend. She played an integral part in not only his life, but others' lives. We're also going to talk about a guy called Larry Mazza. Larry Mazza is a informant. You can see him. He's been on the internet. He's doing shows and stuff. I'm actually, BlackJack, currently in a talk with Larry Mazza to come on the show. I'm kind of waiting. We'll see where it all goes. But I think Larry Mazza does have a fascinating story. He was Greg's right-hand man, basically. He committed murder on behalf of Gregory Scarpa. And we're also going to talk about Lynn Del Vecchio, who BlackJack, as attorney at one point, I know about Lynn Del Vecchio, on the John Connolly level, really, of yes. Corrupt FBI folks. And we'll talk about him and his relationship with Gregory Scarpa. All right, let's get into it. Greg, the Grim Reaper Scarpa, on the sit down. Gregory Scarpa was born May 8th, 1928 in Brooklyn, New York. He was from Bensonhurst. He was born to his parents, Salvatore and Mary. Both of them were from Treviso, BlackJack, which is in northern Italy, which is something I think right out of the gate that I want to discuss, because in Cosa Nostra is a southern thing. And when I say southern, I don't mean, Correct. Georgia and Florida. I mean southern Italy, Calabria, Crotone, Sicily, those areas, Napoli. Those are where the mob was really created and where the headquarters derived from. It's not normal generally where Southern Italians and Sicilians get into bed with Northern. And I think there's a kind of an interesting kind of correlation between the two. They don't respect each other, and it goes way back culturally. The Southern Italy people are looked at as like paupers, kind of in a way. And Northerners look at them kind of in a way that they're better than Southern Italians. And Southern Italians look at Northerners as uppity fashion designers, doctors, kind of the upper class, and they look down on us. And there's always been kind of a strife, if you will, between the two. And when you look into the mafia, it's rare that you'll find a Northerner. And this would be something that Greg would deal with later in his life, which we'll talk about. But BlackJack, there's always been, and this happens a lot, in Europe and in other countries where, even in the same countries. I mean, in Albania, you have it where you have Kosovo and Albania are kind of one, and Serbians kind of look down on Albanians and Kosovo people. And there's all these different inner kind of ethnical wars that are going on. And in Italy, it's not pronounced, but it's there.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely there. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Jeff, that Northern Italians generally have the reputation as being cultured and
Yes.
more educated and more wealthy, whereas Southern Italians are more of the,
Blue
hustling
collar.
to get along variety. You see a lot of guys in the mafia in this country that, their family histories are Naples or Sicily. You really don't get much further north than Rome. I mean, that's pretty much as far north as you'll get. So to have someone from Treviso is rare. But you see it in every society, right? I mean, it happens in our society, right? I mean, people where we're from may look down on people from places like Mississippi or Staten Island, stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's kind of it's not really a big thing, and it's not going to be a thing where they're going to preclude you from being in the mafia, but and it's not like you being Irish and Italian and you're trying to get in where you can't. They're not going to say that, but this would be something that Greg would have to deal with. And a lot of that was also looked at as they considered Northerners as not as tough as Southerners, and that maybe under pressure, these are people that we're not necessarily familiar with. And they're a different culture, and they might not be as strong as we are, and they'll break the omerta, which something interestingly enough that Greg Scarpa would deal with. Greg was raised in the working class neighborhood of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, which, look, if you know about the mob, Bensonhurst is literally
Hotbed.
a hotbed. It is the spot for mobsters. Back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, Bensonhurst was all Italian. I mean, 18th Avenue to this day is an Albanian or an Italian area. During this time, Greg, obviously, this was right after the Great Depression. Greg's father would struggle to make ends meet with his family. His father was a coal delivery worker. So he'd basically drive a truck up and down New York and basically deliver coal. It's a tough job. It's a hard job. It's a dirty job. And it didn't pay real well. Any delivery driver, you look at, I'm not going to say UPS drivers don't get paid well, but they don't make millions either. It's not an easy job. You're not going to get rich off that kind of stuff. And, cold delivery was no different. At age 7 years old, Greg would actually begin working for his father to try to help out and make more deliveries and make ends meet. And this is where Greg really kind of, I think, realizes early that he does not want to work and be like a normal person. He doesn't want to live like regular people. He doesn't want to get dirty. He doesn't want to have to break his back every day to earn a buck. And this is where the old working man is a sucker type of thing comes from. If you've seen A Bronx Tale, think of like C, when he would see his father on the bus. He would see Sonny down the street, getting the women, having the parties, not really working, making money. You're a young kid. It's no secret. And we see it today in gang-led neighborhoods. Why go work at McDonald's when you can go work for the local mobster, the local gang, and make more money? And Greg Scarpa was really meant to, I think, always be a mobster. He was never going to be what his father was. He saw how his father struggled throughout his childhood. Mm-hmm. Greg had an older brother, Salvatore, and he was the first real connection that Greg would have to the mob. He wanted to be like his brother, Sal. Sal was a little older, and he actually had some connections that would develop in the late 40s and 50s, where he was connected to the Profaci crime family. So Greg kind of followed in his brother's footsteps. Greg at basically 17 and 18 was a tough dude. He was a big kid. He was 6 foot, about 200 pounds. He had the look. He was good looking, but he had the look of, he'll break your neck if you need him to. And, he starts running with his brother, starts getting the eye of some different mobsters in the area. And again, Greg would continue to be very enthralled by mobsters. He found that to be exciting. He wanted that exciting life. Greg would start doing little scores, and I mean very little scores. He started stealing mail. He started committing petty theft. He would also have an interesting way of making money, BlackJack, that he would even use into the 70s. He had some sort of key-like object that he could pop telephone booths and steal the change from them.
Yeah.
And he did it on a small level early, but down the road, he would actually go up and down the Garden State Parkway, the different turnpikes, and he would basically boost all the change out of parking payphones and rest stop payphones. So it was big business. And early on, you boost a couple of payphones, you can make some money. Back then, payphones were all they had.
Yeah, I mean, that was actually kind of a popular scam back in the day, is knocking over payphones, right? Parking meters were kind of the same thing. Like, you talk about him having this key, guys would do the same thing with parking meters. They would go and bust into those and get the change. Back then, dude, people dealt solely in cash. There weren't credit cards. There wasn't an app on your phone to pay for it. So, there was cash in these things, and it was a hell of a lot easier to get into than a bank.
Yeah, it really was. And as I said, Greg would use that for many years to come. In 1947, Greg is obviously starting to catch the eye of certain folks. And we've seen this in all these different shows. Obviously, an older mobster. He's always looking for young blood to kind of pump into the organization, to break necks, to break legs, to earn. Greg catches the eye of a guy called Charlie Lo Cicero. Lo Cicero was a consigliere. He was a boss, a capo boss in the Profaci crime family in Bensonhurst. And he loved Greg. He knew Greg was kind of a guy that he could shape and mold into what he wanted. He was willing to obviously hurt people on behalf of the family. And he loved Greg. He liked his ambition. He schooled him in all these different rackets. He taught Greg how to extort. He taught Greg how to run book. He taught Greg how to give out loans. Truck hijacking, all sorts of mob rackets he taught Greg about. And, again, he saw Greg's ability and that he wanted to be something down the road. During this time, Greg meets a woman called Connie Forrest. He goes to a local bar. She's a beautiful blonde, good-looking girl. Greg starts dating her. He gets her pregnant, and they have 2 children. Greg's senior and a daughter as well. Greg Senior... Greg Jr. would actually end up going into the mob years later, and we'll talk about him. Obviously, Greg's making money for the family. He's a high riser, if you will, but he's still just an associate. He's just still making small scores and doing some dirty work for Charlie Lo Cicero. In 1953, Greg would be called on to commit his first murder and to make his bones. Keep in mind, he's 25 years old. So Greg was an early riser, and he was fairly young, BlackJack, when he was made. Basically, the operation says, hey, look, we have a guy we need dealt with. He's reneging on some things. You need to go take care of it. They gave him a gun, where they could find him and what he looked like. Greg took care of business. And in 1953, Greg would be a made man in the Profaci crime family. 25 years old, very early.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very young age to be formally inducted. But as you said, this is kind of the path that guys take. Ultimately, you're brought along as a younger kid, you get involved in some different rackets, and then someone's going to put you to the test and say, hey, we need you to do this. And you see how you measure up. Greg Scarpa measured up just fine.
Yeah. And look, like I said, big guy, always willing to do what he had to do. And he was being schooled quickly in the ranks. And he learned how, look, I can make money. This is how I do it. Greg would also get involved in truck hijacking, counterfeit credit cards, all sorts of different things. Greg was really a career criminal, and he didn't want to just be, an associate or a soldier. He wanted to go up and be a higher up in the family. In the late 50s, Greg would get his own crew. He also got a social club, which is a norm in mob circles. He went into Diker Heights and got a bar called the Wimpy Boys Social Club. That's where they would play cards, and they would have dinner. And, it was always kind of an interesting name just because Greg was anything but a wimp. But it was
The hell
kind
of
of,
a name.
yeah, it was kind of a play on words. And the thing Greg also started doing is he started kind of creating a reputation around Brooklyn that Greg Scarpa was not only someone to not fuck with, but Greg Scarpa was not someone you even wanted mad at you. And if you've ever seen Greg Scarpa, he was a pretty demented looking individual. He was a guy that I think if you saw on the street, you would probably try to run the other way. And he scared a lot of people, BlackJack. You've seen Greg Scarpa. He's a scary looking guy, but he also has some charisma to him. He's got that, low voice. He's gravelly voice. You're just a tough dude who would blow your head off if he had to.
Yeah, I mean, he is, as you said, he had a look to him that really just said you don't want to mess with this guy, right? I mean, I don't know how to describe it.
Well, I'll describe it.
He looked like a badass. Like sometimes he has the mustache, sometimes he doesn't. But by the way, the mustache was an incredible mustache.
Yeah,
But sometimes he doesn't have it, and he looks menacing.
Yeah. Did you ever see Chuck Zito?
Yeah.
That actor, he played in Oz and Sons of Anarchy, and he always would have a mustache. He kind of looked, like a tougher Chuck Zito. I always thought.
Yeah, a little bit.
But Greg Scarpa was, and he dressed well and he looked powerful and people knew what he was. He was a mobster. He looked just like a mobster. Dark features, dark hair, very tan. Just looked like a mobster. It's pretty simple. And he created a rep that, people weren't going to fuck with him. As Greg kind of continues to create rackets in the early 60s, the FBI was beginning to really zone in on truck hijacking. It was a big problem. Airports were getting stuff boosted. People were getting boosted left and right. So they started putting more scrutiny on truck hijacking. And this is where Greg gets jammed up for the first time. In the 60s, he gets jammed up on a truck hijacking beef. And the FBI basically goes to him and says, look, we've never been able to do this. We're going to try to do it with you. We'll get you out of this. But how about we do this? How about you start giving us some info? We'll pay you. We'll create a relationship. Nobody's going to know you're doing it. We'll meet you in secret. Work for us for a little bit, And Greg, I think initially was like, you know what? It's going to get me out of this. I'll make a little bit of a connection with the feds. I'll be protected. I won't get arrested, and I can have my cake and eat it too. And at that point, Greg agrees in 1962 to work as an undercover informant for the FBI. And this would create a long relationship that would have many twists and turns. In 1964, Greg is a snappy dresser. That was one thing about Greg that, as we talked about his look, he was always manicured well. He always had the mustache and the hair and, the tan. But Greg was also a really stylish guy. He would always have the most stylish duds on. He always had a ton of money, the pinky rings. He had multiple homes. And he would start to get the attention of people, particularly women. He was married, but Greg was, as many mobsters were, known to be, let's just say, promiscuous.
Yeah, he was married, but he didn't take it that seriously.
Yeah. Greg would be out at a club called the Flamingo Lounge in Brooklyn, where he'd meet a young woman called Linda Shiro. Linda was very young. I believe she was 18 when Greg met her. And look, I'm going to say this, very attractive. Have you seen Linda Shiro, BlackJack?
I have.
Very attractive. Okay. I mean, There's no secret. Very pretty, dark, black hair. Had striking features, pretty girl. And she was much younger than Greg. I believe she was like 20 years younger than Greg was at the time. So Greg took a liking to Linda. She kind of, provided him what he didn't get from his wife, and she was his gumata, as they say. In 1964, they continue dating. Linda is told by Greg that they're going to Mississippi for something. Linda kind of felt like, oh, maybe this is a vacation or something, but it was for something else. Around this time, the mob was not a focus for the FBI. This was really in the middle of the civil rights moment, and the FBI was dealing with a lot of things, particularly the Ku Klux Klan and individuals like that. The FBI contacted Greg that year and basically recruited him to go and help them locate civil rights workers that were missing in Mississippi. If you've ever seen Mississippi burning, you know about this story. And this is true stuff. This actually happened. And if you know anything about mob history, this isn't the first time the FBI consulted with mobsters on foreign issues or domestic issues. The mob consulted with Lucky Luciano during the U.S. consulted with Lucky Luciano during World War II. So this is not the first time, but they knew Greg had, abilities to interrogate people, a lot of it illegal, but the FBI was willing to, do what they had to do to find their guy. So they tasked Greg with going down a little adventure to Mississippi, giving him a gun and some money to go find these guys. Greg and another individual allegedly find the guy, Lawrence Bird. He was a TV salesman. He had a TV shop in Laurel, Mississippi. And he was also a guy that they believe was in the Ku Klux Klan. Greg would take him to a local army base and basically beat him to a pulp, stick a gun down his throat and tell him that if he didn't give up the info, he's going to blow his head off. At that point, Bird tells him exactly where the bodies were buried. Now, there has been some questions about the authenticity of this story, but a lot of high-ranking people have testified that it actually did happen. So there's no reason to not believe it. It's been referenced in documentaries and all sorts of things about Greg Scarpa. So BlackJack, they went to Greg Scarpa and said, look, we can't find these people. We know you can interrogate and get things done. Go down to Mississippi on behalf of the government. We'll pay you and go find these guys.
Yeah, it's another shocking turn by the government, if you ask me, because basically what they're doing is they're employing one of the largest mass murderers in American history to go down and basically torture people in the name of the U.S. government.
Well,
as
we've seen with Guantanamo Bay and other places, they're willing to definitely torture folks for.
Yeah, they are. It's just when you sit back and think about the U.S. government getting in bed with Greg Scarpa, a man whose nickname is the Grim Reaper.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
It kind of makes you wonder what they're doing.
Yeah. Also in 1966, the FBI would also ask Greg to help them in the murder case of a guy called Vernon Dahmer, who was allegedly set on fire by the Ku Klux Klan and killed. Greg would also go down and do that. But this is where things would kind of not work out for Greg and the FBI. Greg had a disagreement about rewards he was being supposedly provided, which he never got. The FBI got sick of Greg and dropped him as a confidential informant. So Greg was back on the street. And he was back earning. However, he didn't have the connection to the FBI anymore. Greg continued, though, to earn on behalf of the Mafia. He was rich in power. He had connections. He was doing things. And he had two more children to Linda Shiro, a son, Joey, and a daughter, little Linda Shiro. So Greg and his girlfriend, Linda Shiro, basically named their daughter Linda, which is not a normal thing. Usually you don't see a Linda Jr. type of thing, no. But they named their daughter Linda, who actually, I will say, to this day has put out some very good stuff on her father as far as his life and stuff. She did some documentaries. She's actually quite compelling when you hear about her. During this time in the 70s and even into the 80s, things are going haywire for the Colombo crime family. As we've talked about in the Carmine Persico episode, Carmine was in and out. He was always kind of jockeying for power. And Carmine was someone that could always trust Greg Scarpa. Greg was a loyalist to Carmine and really to the end would follow him. In 1980, the FBI makes a run again at Greg Scarpa. Lynn Del Vecchio decides, hey, I'm going to go pay this guy a visit and see if we can't start a relationship up with him again. He obviously had some good info. Let's see if we can get him back on the payroll. Scarpa initially said, get the fuck out of here when they asked him to do it. But 2 weeks later, he would call DeVecchio, and he persuaded him to cooperate again. During their relationship, and I want to make this very clear, Lynn DeVecchio is a scumbag to the highest nth degree. He had a relationship that you should not have with an informant. BlackJack, you know this. An informant is obviously someone you want to get information about, but you shouldn't be going over for dinner at their house. And Scarpa would provide DeVecchio with cash, jewelry, and other gifts. They would have family outings together with their wives. And the FBI paid Greg Scarpa a lot of money.
Yeah.
Greg would also joke to Mafia associates that he would have a girlfriend that was part of law enforcement who would give him the information.
I mean, I like that he referred to Linda Vecchio as a girlfriend because, I mean, that's really what he was. I mean, Linda Vecchio is unbelievable when it comes to the level of corruption here because, as you talked about, you know, we talked about this in the Whitey Bulger case quite a bit with John Connolly, but I think DeVecchio is worse because his relationship was so close with Scarpa, and it seemingly was out in the open. I mean, as you said, they would spend holidays together. I mean, if you're in law enforcement, you treat an informant as an asset. Period. That's it. They're not personal friends. They're not family friends. You're not exchanging gifts. And then there's the issue of how many people did DeVecchio wind up getting killed with the information that he was passing to Scarpa? I mean, you remember the Colombos, Jeff, were constantly at war with each other during this time. Right. How much information was given to Scarpa that resulted in people's deaths because of a corrupt FBI agent?
It was also testified that DeVecchio was a frequent dinner guest at Scarpa's home, and on one occasion, Scarpa provided him with a Cabbage Patch doll that was hard to find for a child. And look, some agents began to wonder about the connections that Greg and Lynn were creating. They were not normal. It was kind of disturbing closeness, if you will. In the late 70s, I want to talk about Larry Mazza for a second. Larry Mazza, as I said, was part of Greg's crew. He was basically Greg's number two. He did things on behalf of Greg. He was always in constant contact with Greg. And I want to kind of talk about his story quickly. Whether you believe Larry Mazza or not, I do. I find his story to be pretty compelling and fascinating. I think he's one informant that really has an interesting story. So, BlackJack, do you know a lot about Larry Mazza at all or no?
Not a ton, just as much as it relates to Greg Scarpa.
Okay. So I want to kind of, and this all kind of melds together. So Larry Mazza is, I think, 17 at the time, in the late 70s. I think he was born in 61. So this was probably 78, 79. Larry is working locally at a grocery store in Brooklyn. They were from the same area. Larry starts delivering groceries. One of his stops was the Scarpa household. He begins to, as any young 17, 18-year-old man would do in the company of a pretty woman that's older, maybe he developed a little bit of a crush. They flirted a little bit. Before you know it, Larry Mazza is hooking up with Linda Shiro. And this is known. This is known really, if you follow anything about Larry, it's been out in the New York Daily News, that kind of stuff. He starts basically working for Greg down the road, and Greg doesn't know about this initially. And they try to keep it secret. Well, one day, Greg says, "Hey, look, I got to talk to you about something." And he brings up Linda and how he knows that Linda and him are sleeping together. And I think the first thought would be, okay, Larry Mazza is probably a dead man. Greg Scarpa kind of just says, look, keep her happy. No one else can know. Greg had multiple women. I don't think he cared. I think he just wanted to keep Linda happy. She liked Larry. They had a liking for each other. And he trusted Larry at the end of the day. And weirdly enough, it's kind of this weird sex triangle where Greg Scarpa was basically allowing a subordinate to have sex with his wife or girlfriend, which is kind of wild. And Larry would talk about that years later and kind of his connection throughout with Greg. That's kind of a wild story though, right?
It's a strange start to their relationship for sure. You would think somebody with the body count of Greg Scarpa finds out that someone's given it to his old lady, the response is going to be to cut him into pieces. But instead, his answer is just do a good job.
Yeah, basically, have sex with my wife. I won't be around, and don't let anyone find out it's going on. Just us three. During this time as well in the 80s, he makes the forged connection with DeVecchio again and begins obviously cooperating. In 1984, Greg is killing people on the regular for the Colombo Crime Family. And this is where he would kill someone that he shouldn't kill, but he had to kill. Little Alley Boy Persco, who was the son of Carmine Persco, was moving around. He was doing things, and he was implicated in some crimes. Little Alley Boy decides to run and go up to upstate New York. He had a girlfriend at the time called Mary Berry. Berry was someone that knew a lot about Alley Boy. People were fearful that she was going to go to the FBI, and Greg was tasked in killing Mary Berry. At that point, Greg takes care of business. He kills her on the dance floor of the Whippy Boy Social Club. Greg just had no thought in his mind. If something had to be done, it didn't matter who it was, he was going to go kill them. So Greg was running this scheme at the FBI, but he was also regularly committing murders. He was allowing subordinates to fuck his wife. He was doing all sorts of stuff. Greg Scarpa was a bad individual. It was also testified and discussed by Greg's daughter, Linda, and Larry Mazza, that in the 80s, Greg loved his kids, obviously. He was a great father, according to them. He gave little Linda, anything she wanted. And I guess he was worried about her going to school, so he hired her a car service, when she was in high school, to take her to and from school. Well, one day, little Linda's getting driven to school. Some scumbag driver decides, well, I'm going to try to rape her. He takes her to Prospect Park and attempts to rape her. Ugh. She smartly enough says, hey, look, it doesn't have to be like this. Let me get to school. I'll sneak out and we can meet somewhere. And the guy stops. And it was a good idea by her.
Hell yeah.
She gets to school and immediately calls her father, Greg Scarpa. And Larry Mazza talked about, Greg says to them, look, go rough this guy up and beat him up bad. I don't want him doing any of this again. They do it. They report back that the guy's basically in the hospital and he ain't going to fuck with nobody anymore. Greg accepts it. A few hours later, Greg says, you know what? Fuck that guy. Let's just kill him. And they go and kill the driver, which I would probably say in all of Greg's murders, this was probably the most accepting, I think, just because.
Yeah, I mean, dude, 100%. I mean, this one is downright justifiable, right? Like this one, I'm okay with what he did here.
Yeah, I mean, the guy was a scumbag. He tried to rape his daughter. And, you know, as any parent would say, you're not going to fuck with a kid and, you know, just get away with it. It's just not going to happen. Greg Scarpa would also be doing some other things that would start to get him into some trouble. Greg was known to drink on occasion. He was a social drinker. Didn't drink a ton, but he would drink, you know, nightly probably, you know, have a cocktail at the end of the evening or with dinner or something.
Yep.
And he was also known to be not a hypochondriac, but he would pop aspirin constantly, like a ton of them. I'm talking about every day for decades on end, 5, 6, 10 aspirin every day. And Mazza would say that he would do it just to do it. Like he didn't, you know, how like when you drink, you don't want to get a hangover, so you pop a Tylenol.
That's it, buddy.
Greg would do that
pretty good.
Yeah, Greg would do that every night, like for like decades on end. And look, anybody that knows anything about a body knows that, you know, you constantly are popping straight aspirin, you know, your stomach and your kidneys are going to just get destroyed. And Greg started getting stomach ulcers in 1985. And around that time, they just started bursting. Greg, in 1986, needs to have emergency ulcer surgery at Victory Memorial Hospital. The problem was Greg was losing a ton of blood. And Greg in the hospital realized that he's going to have to start getting blood donations for a transfusion, I guess. And they need to donate it. Greg throws up the stop here sign and says, no, hold on a second. Greg did not want Black people donating blood. He had, you know, whether he was racist. Yeah, obviously. Greg didn't want gay people donating. He didn't want people that he didn't know donating because this was the height of the AIDS epidemic. But he also probably was racist and didn't want Black people donating blood to him, which has been talked about. So he assumed that, hey, if I just get my family and my associates to donate, Everything will be fine. I know where the blood's coming from. And I don't want hospital blood bank blood. So he starts going to all of his associates and subordinates and saying, look, do one for the team here, do one for your old skipper, start giving blood. One of the people that donates blood is a guy called Paul Melly. Melly was an associate of Greg. He worked in Greg's crew. He was a big bruising guy. He was known to have taken steroids. Little did Melly know, years earlier, he had contracted HIV from a dirty steroid needle, and he transferred it to Greg Scarpa in the transfusion.
Yeah. I mean, this
So
guy was a bodybuilder.
yeah,
And it's the irony here is just so rich, isn't it? Like he doesn't want this dirty blood of other people in him, and he winds up getting HIV from one of his very associates.
yeah, it's truly just wild. Greg would later sue the hospital and win a $300,000 settlement in 1992, but it didn't matter. All the money in the world Greg would give to not be HIV positive, because Greg knew, and everybody knew in the 80s at the time, HIV was something that they didn't have an answer to. They didn't have a fix to.
Yeah. I mean, up until Magic Johnson, HIV was
yeah,
a death sentence.
yeah, surely was. And, obviously today it's a lot different. You can live with AIDS, but, back then, Greg knew that his time would come quick, and he began behaving in a way that, was a bit demented, frankly. As we know, in the Colombo crime family, there was always some sort of beef, right? In 1984, Carmine Persico gets 140 years, as we talked about. And as we also talked about, Victor Arena starts trying to seize control of the Colombo crime family. Greg was always loyal to Carmine Persico, and he was always going to protect Carmine. And he was a mobster. And at the end of the day, he was going to get in line and do what he was told. In 1991, supporters of Vic Arena would try to kill Greg Scarpa. Arena realizes Greg Scarpa is a guy you don't want on the street. He's dangerous. We obviously don't have him in our camp. We got to kill Greg Scarpa.
Yeah, loose cannon.
Yeah, he is a very loose cannon. He's a dangerous dude. And keep in mind, Persico loyalists had also attempted to kill Vic Arena. So Vic was kind of seething with anger, and he wanted Greg dead. In retaliation, Arena decides to murder Scarpa. On November 18th, 1991, Gregory Scarpa and his daughter, little Linda, and their grandson are coming out of Scarpa's home in Brooklyn. They get into a car. Scarpa's daughter gets into another car, and they began driving down the street. At that point, a van kind of blocks them in and begins shooting up the cars. Greg manages somehow to whisk away, and his daughter does as well. Surprisingly, no one is hurt, including the little baby. But as we know with Greg, he had a temper, and he was absolutely enraged. He was furious. He kind of said, look, I'm going to kill whoever is involved with this, whoever was said to be involved, kind of how Anthony Casso did when Gotti and DeChico and those guys tried to kill him. He went to no end to find every person involved. Greg wouldn't care that there were bystanders around. It didn't matter. During this conflict, Scarpa was basically the commander on the street of the Colombo military squad. He would literally drive around Brooklyn and hunt for Arena people. And I mean that. They would literally, Mazza testified that at 12 o'clock, they would meet at Greg's, and all day they would search Brooklyn high and low for Arena people. He was weakened by the illness, remember. Greg looked like a shell of what he once was. He was skinny. He looked gaunt, but he was still a tough motherfucker. He looked totally different. If you've ever seen pictures of him, BlackJack, he looked totally different.
Very different guy.
He would cruise Avenue U looking for Arena supporters in social clubs, bars, clubs, wherever. And look, he knew that Bill Catolo was involved. And he also knew that there were other guys involved as well that actually carried out the hit. He would kill Rosario Nastasa, James Malpiso, Nicky Grancillo, which Maz, I believe, pulled the trigger, and a guy called Vincent Fusaro. Fusaro, actually, this is kind of a fucked up death. Fusaro was hanging Christmas lights at his house. Scarpa sees Fasara and says, there he is, fucking shoot him. As he's hanging Christmas lights, he's killed in front of his home.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff, there's a reason why prisons keep guys on death row segregated from everyone else. It's because they have nothing to lose. And in Greg Scarpa's mind, he's serving a death sentence right now with AIDS. So he has absolutely nothing to lose. He's going to be more brazen, more violent, and more unhinged than he's ever been in his life because he's already received the death penalty.
According to Mazza, Greg absolutely, quote, loved it as he killed the individuals that were involved. In 1991, the war with Victor Arena would end. As we know with Arena, he was indicted and put away for life. The war would die down. And as we know with the Colombo Crime Family, we still have no idea who's running the family. But at this point, all thoughts were that little Ali Bopersko was running the family in and out of prison. Greg would also interview at this point with CBS, which is kind of an interesting move, and talk about his life. Also, this would kind of put a lot of crimps in Greg's armor. In 1992, Greg is indicted on multiple racketeering counts and 3 murders. The problem Gregory Scarpa had was he was informing on people for years. And I think he assumed in this case, I've been informing, I'm going to be fine, nothing's going to happen. The problem was people like Larry Mazza, people like Joey D'Ambrosio that were in his crew, they start getting picked up. And they go to prison and they start hearing, hey, fucking Greg's a rat. And he's been a rat for 30 years.
Yep.
So maybe you don't want to start trying to save Greg Scarpa. And Larry Mazza and others start cooperating. And Greg is basically fucked because Linda Vecchio can't save Greg anymore. It doesn't help that every person involved here is going in and saying, that guy told me to do it, Greg, and multiple people are saying he did it. It's hard to hide that anymore. You can't openly commit murders. Greg was going to go away. Luckily, though, due to his poor health, he was given electronic monitoring and told to stay at home. On December 29th, 1992, Greg's living at home under house arrest when a situation would arise involving his son. His son, Greg Jr., was in the mob. He had his own crew. But he had another son, a younger son called Joey. And Joey was a real fucking punk, this guy. And I shouldn't say that. Joey Scarpa died, so I maybe shouldn't say that. But he was a fucking punk.
Yeah, he was. Let's not sugarcoat it. It is what it is.
Yeah, Joey Scarpa was a drug dealer. He was a shithead. And he was one of these guys that would, hey, you know who my fucking father is? That was the kind of guy Joey Scarpa was. Joey Scarpa starts selling heroin, cocaine, a lot of weed, a lot of drugs, and was a tough kid. I mean, he was part of a tough crew. And a lot of these tough farm team type of crews were running around in Brooklyn. Bath Avenue crew was one. The Tanglewood Boys was another. Mm-hmm. Michael DeRosa had a crew, a Lucchese family associate. A guy called Galino, James Galino. And if that name sounds familiar, Galino's father, Ralph, was involved with John Gotti in that McBratney hit. Froggy, they called him, was a son of Galino. Froggy was running a drug crew as well in the Lucchese's. These guys were all running around. These were all younger sons of mobsters, basically. So Joey Scarpa is involved in a deal with a kid, Michael DeRosa. They called him Michael Flat Top. He's kind of an interesting character as well. DeRosa and him kind of renege on something. They get in a beef. And they beat up DeRosa, or they try to beat DeRosa up. DeRosa gets the better of Scarpa. And as usual with Joey Scarpa, he runs home to his dad and complains. Greg's in bed one night. Joey comes running in with blood all over him saying that, Michael and his people beat me up and they robbed me. Greg goes nuts because as we know with Greg, with his kids, you don't fuck with his kids. They drive to DeRosa's home. And DeRosa's at home with himself, his brother, and a guy called Ronald Moran. Ronald Moran's an interesting kid. Moran is about 400 pounds. He's Irish. He's fat. He's huge. But there was one thing about Moran that a lot of people would say. He was a hell of a shooter. He could shoot people. And he was kind of muscle for DeRosa. So Greg approaches with his son, and they start lighting up the house. DeRosa and Moran come out. They start kind of trading shots back. Ronald Moran hits Greg Scarpa in the eye. Greg pulls away, and they leave. He gets home. He's bleeding profusely. Keep in mind, he has AIDS. And Linda Scarpa has no idea what to do. They try to use Scotch whiskey on the wound. That doesn't work. And Greg has to go to the hospital. Greg doesn't want to go to the hospital, but he has to. Keep in mind during all this, the home monitoring is calling. The police are calling. Everybody's calling. What the fuck is going on, Greg? Greg's trying to tell them nothing's wrong. I'm fine. Da-da-da-da-da. At that point, prosecutors revoke Greg's house arrest and send him to jail. And that was the end for Gregory Scarpa. By 19... Yeah.
I mean, think about that for 1 second, Jeff.
Yeah.
You get shot in the eye, right? Like, you're, number one, amazingly lucky to be alive that didn't go to your brain. And your answer is to dump whiskey in your eye.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a psychopath move.
Yeah, it would eventually leave him blind in that eye. And by 1993, Greg was in real bad shape. He was in prison. He was blind in one eye. He was emaciated by this point, and in very poor health. On May 6, 1993, Greg Scarpa would plead guilty to 3 murders and a conspiracy to commit several other murders. It was said in Greg's life that he killed in upwards of 100 individuals, maybe more than that. There's no exact amount. According to Larry Mazza, Greg said he stopped counting after 50. So there were a lot of murders that Greg committed. And he ended up being charged with a few of them. And he was sentenced on December 15, 1993, and given life. The sentence would later be reduced to 10 years due to Greg's poor health. Look, the truth of the matter was Greg Scarpa was not going to live more than 2 or 3 years, and he was going to die. He would die basically a year later. On June 4th, 1994, Gregory Scarpa died at the FMC in Rochester, Minnesota, from AIDS-related complications. Now, obviously that's the end of Greg Scarpa, but this would not be the end for his old friend, Lindley DeVecchio. Scarpa obviously would be revealed as a rat. And at this point, other Colombo people started talking as well, including Carmine Sessa, who was the consigliere of the family. He becomes a rat. And he tells people that, hey, look, this DeVecchio's dirty, and you got to do something about it. Mazza also started contributing, and people started contributing. Prosecutors were forced to reveal that maybe DeVecchio might have revealed confidential information, including information about Colombo members who would turn informants to Greg Scarpa. And obviously that's a no-no. But I think a lot of them had hoped it was just kind of the cost of business, and maybe some things got out. Ultimately, 19 Arena supporters had murder charges thrown out and their convictions reversed after attorneys contended DeVecchio's collaboration with Scarpa tainted the evidence. And that pretty much all of the members that were said to be on trial for murder, well, they did it because of self-defense. And that kind of, in a way, BlackJack, all the stuff was tainted.
It was absolutely tainted, right? I mean, you've got a law enforcement officer who is presumably the lead on a lot of these cases that there's now tangible evidence was in cahoots with a member of organized crime. It's absolutely tainted. There's no way those convictions can stand.
The attorneys would also argue for their clients that DeVecchio would give Scarpa information he used to kill members of the Arena faction, namely Grancio, Fusaro, those kind of guys. And thus, those folks that were involved in those killings did them on self-defense. So there was a lot of things that were tainted. Greg was getting info that he shouldn't have been getting. I mean, let's be real. I mean, DeVecchio wasn't committing murder like the Mafia cops, but I mean, he was doing a lot of things similar to them.
No, he's every bit as bad because, first of all, and there are some reports from people that DeVecchio actively did help Scarpa kill people, right? So there are those reports out there. Now, whether you believe those or not is one thing, but there's no question that he gave information that led directly to the murders of people. That puts their blood on your hands. There's no way around that.
In 2006, Lynn DeVecchio was forced to retire from the FBI in 1996. But in 2006, he was indicted on charges of complicity with Scarpa and other Colombo mobsters in 4 different murders. So the axe was starting to drop on Lynn DeVecchio, and he was starting to look like one of the most corrupt FBI agents really since John Connolly, and maybe bigger than John Connolly. The government case would rest on the testimony of one person, Linda Scarpa, Greg's gumata for a lot of years. She was pretty loyal to Greg, and at the end of the day, she would testify against her old friend Linda Vecchio, who she met many times. But the problem was she would be discredited as a witness after reporter Tom Robbins of the Village Voice revealed that she had granted an interview to him and also gangland reporter Jerry Capisci a decade earlier. And she would deny that DeVecchio had ever been involved with anything. Robbins said that while he and Capisci had promised to protect Shira's identity and not attribute any of her revelations to her, the prospect of DeVecchio facing life in prison trumped any promises they had made to Shiro. So they basically burned Shiro for DeVecchio. That's pretty much what happened.
Well, they try to, but ultimately that doesn't work out either.
Yeah. On November 1st, 2007, the judge in the case would dismiss every charge against Lynn DeVecchio at the request of prosecutors. So, as usual, Lynn DeVecchio should be in prison right now, but he's gallivanting around South Florida in a Corvette and doing his thing and telling everyone in 60 Minutes and Anderson Cooper that he's – by the way, Anderson Cooper did a good piece on DeVecchio on 60 Minutes about kind of the kind of guy he was.
Yeah.
He contends to this day that he didn't do anything wrong.
A couple of interesting things to know. People may be wondering why the case got dismissed. It got dismissed because Robbins and Capisci told Linda Shiro that she was off the record, right? That they would not use it or attribute it to her, and then decided to go ahead and do that. And you can't do that. Like, there's just certain protections you're afforded. And if a reporter tells you that you're going to be off the record and you're not going to be used, then you can't be used. So without her statement under oath, and you've got this other thing hanging out there, there's no way that she's a credible witness. So that gets rid of that case. And the other thing that I find really interesting, Jeff, is that Lynn DeVecchio wrote a book in 2011, and the name of the book is really just a fucking work of art. It's called "We're Going to Win This Thing: The Shocking Frame-Up of a Mafia Crime Buster."
Yeah, it's a wild title. Yeah, he really is delusional, Lynn DeVecchio. This is the kind of guy I'd love to talk to. He never would talk to us, but I would love to talk to him.
Yeah.
So, yeah, he never went to prison for anything. Like I said, he's in Florida somewhere. I think he has a PI business. So maybe we shouldn't talk too much about him because they'll start looking into us.
Maybe we could try to hire him on like a proposed case or something.
Yes, and get him jammed up on something.
I'll work on it.
All right. Scarpa's other son, Greg Jr., was sentenced to 40 years in prison for racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and other charges. Keep in mind, his son, Joey Scarpa, would be murdered in the 80s during some drug deals that went bad. So Greg's son, Joey, died. And interestingly enough, Greg Scarpa Jr. actually just was released from prison. He's kind of an interesting kid because when he was arrested, Scarpa Jr., he got 40 years, and he was jailing at MDC in Brooklyn. And they had him with Ramzi Youssef, who was the alleged mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Scarpa would provide the government with information against Youssef. According to Scarpa Jr., he claimed that Youssef had spoken to him about plans to bomb an airplane or kidnap an American attorney to declare Youssef's 96 trial a mistrial. He would also state that Youssef had implied assistance from a foreign government, presumably Qatar, since Youssef's maternal uncle was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was living there and was a cabinet official in that country. In 1996, Scarpa would also claim Ramzi Youssef set a bomb through DHL Postal Service and planned to bomb an airplane. Scarpa also noticed that Youssef had people from England scouting the Atlanta Olympic Games. So Greg would provide some pretty good information. He would also try to reduce his sentence to 30 years. And he had been fighting for decades. He did fight for decades and did get out. As I said, Greg Scarpa Jr., I believe, is out of prison as far as I know. According to the fraternal or for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, he is out currently. So there you go. Greg Scarpa, kind of a wild story, a wild tale. He goes from being an enforcer on the streets to a mobster to a made man to an informant to a crime crusader in Mississippi for the civil rights movement to not an informant anymore, just a mobster, to a capo, to a murderer, to a psychopathic lunatic, to an AIDS person gets AIDS, and then all sorts of stuff shakes out. A wild story. One thing we could say about Greg Scarpa, BlackJack, he was a complete lunatic. He would kill you, no questions asked, not even a question. What do you have to say about the end of Greg Scarpa?
I think that Greg Scarpa will go down, if we're being honest with each other, as one of the most prolific murderers in American history of any sort. You know, we talk about serial killers in life a lot and mass murderers and things like that. I can't think of someone off the top of my head who's got a bigger body count than Greg Scarpa. He is one of the most notorious, prolific murderers that has ever existed in this country.
Yeah, I think if we were able to prove it, I think you could surely set him up there. The problem with him is there's no way to ever prove how many people he actually killed. But as I said, the FBI would estimate that it was over 100 people. And look, I mean, outside of soldiers that are trained killers, I don't know if there's a person that's done that. It's pretty unbelievable. Greg was a rat at the end of the day, and he's probably the worst of them. He secretly did it. He did it through no other reason but to get paid and to create his own power from it. He didn't do it to get out of crime. Well, he did, I guess, per se, but he didn't have to do it to the level that he did it. He was someone that enabled others. He enabled the government enabled him. And it's pretty pathetic to think about that the government got in bed with someone like Greg Scarpa, and that makes you wonder.
Sure.
And they would allow Greg Scarpa to skate for a long time,
And
even into the 80s.
Enabled his killings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And ultimately it would do him in. But Greg Scarpa didn't die in prison because he was in prison. He died because he had AIDS. Pretty simple. It also is kind of poetic justice that Greg Scarpa died because he was so worried about black people and gay people that he didn't even consider that his own underlings were scumbags as well and that they would give him AIDS. But Greg Scarpa, a fascinating individual who was never boss, but was very powerful. And it's interesting to think about because, you know, as we kind of end the show, one thing BlackJack that I always found interesting was in the mob, there is no happy ending, right? There's no, it's very rare that you die in your own bed, right? A couple people have done it.
I mean, listen, as John Gotti said, you either go out in a box or in a cell.
And that's one of the last half hour of The Irishman is incredible. And that, I think, what makes the movie so good is Frank Sheeran realizes by the end of his life that all the people that he knew or didn't know or whatever, but all the things he had done, because he definitely did things, it didn't matter. At the end of the day, there was no happy ending to him, and there was no happy ending to Greg Scarpa. And you look at all the people involved, Carmine Persico, and look at every person we talk about. There's no happy ending for these folks. Okay. They all die or they have to look over their shoulder their entire life. And back, in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of honor to being in the mob. I've said before, and I'll say it again. If I grew up in the 60s, I'd have been in the mob for sure. 1,000%. Because when I was younger, I had a good childhood, but it didn't matter. I thought people like that were fascinating, and I would, connect to people like that. And, luckily, I didn't do things that I shouldn't, but it's no surprise that kids do the things that Greg Scarpa did and became what he did. But all in all, there's no happy ending. And Greg Scarpa is a cautionary tale of, going one way when he could have went another. He didn't have parents that were in the mob. Greg was fooled by money and stuff that wasn't necessarily there. And He died a pretty terrible death. One final word, BlackJack. In 1994, when Greg Scarpa died, it was estimated and reported by the hospital that Greg weighed 53 pounds at the time of his
Holy
death.
shit.
53 pounds. That's a
AIDS
grown
a
man.
motherfucker, man.
Yeah, AIDS is crazy, man. You know, and you got to look back. I mean, we talked about Capone with syphilis and Greg with AIDS. Got to wonder. Greg would have died in prison probably, but then again, would he have? 10 years, he'd have gotten out. He'd have been a young man.
Well, he probably wouldn't have gotten the 10 years if he didn't have AIDS.
That's true. Good point. But he was a cooperator, I feel like.
We've had some odd deaths. We've had an AIDS death, a syphilis death, a COVID death.
Oh, yeah. Anthony Casso, who we'll talk about next week. I wanted to kind of put some – the reason we're putting Scarpa out this week is because the Persco episode is so fresh that I kind of wanted them to go hand in hand.
They're intertwined, yeah.
Right. And we had Capone kind of in the middle. But all right, before we go, I want to thank all of you folks that listen. Make sure you follow us on Twitter at the Sit Down 7. We're getting closer and closer to 5,000 subscribers. We're doing some cool little giveaways, you know, if you retweet the show, and I'm trying to get the show out there. So we got some big plans, really hoping it all works out and, you know, we get a bigger platform, because I think there's so many things to do with this show still. And we thank all of you for joining us every week. If you have somebody you want us to talk about. Oh, one other thing real quick. And I know we're kind of short on time, so I want to make this quick. I'm going to get to everyone, guys. Remember, this show's only there's a week. We have one show a week. Okay. We can't do every single person, you know, every single day. We're going to get to all the smaller guys. We're trying to put some of the bigger people up front. We're going to get to some of the smaller groups, though, I promise. But if you have somebody you want us to talk about, feel free to reach out. BlackJack, great stuff. Thanks for coming on as always. Always a great show. The Sit Down, always a great show. We'll be back next week. We'll talk Anthony Casso. And make sure you all have a good week. Have a good week. Bye-bye.